So my main role with Plug and Play Fashion for Good is I spend every day trying to scout and find new innovations that can make the fashion industry more sustainable. And as well as that, within our accelerator program, I help a little bit with the sort of mentoring them and helping them grow and seeing sort of what future customers we can introduce them to. And we also do a little bit of investment on the side if, some of the startups have some financial needs.
Great. And my name is Isabelle, and I run the accelerator program that we've set up in partnership with Fashion for Good about 1.5 years ago. We'll come back to that because I think we've put together a unique model. Yes, a unique model to accelerate and scale innovations in this industry. Before we start, I'd like to ask who in the room is a startup or technology, and who isn't already in the field of fashion or sustainable fashion? Okay, so that is great because we really like to interact with people who might not know about the topic. Probably not the ideal situation with a mic, but I'd like to ask you this question of what sustainable fashion means for you. Maybe one or two people can jump in and have an idea, drop an idea of maybe what's wrong with the industry and what should be sustainable with fashion. Anyone? Durable? Yeah. Any other ideas? What's wrong? Okay, we'll talk about it. So basically, you're already there. Our idea of a sustainable fashion is actually moving from what we call the take, make, dispose linear model to a circular model. I think if you're in the ClimateLaunchpad, you might be probably familiar with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, with the circular economy concepts. But essentially, the textile industry is one of the most linear industries in the world. We produce, make, and use. Sometimes we'll see, Emma will go through the numbers. We'll wear 1, 2, twice, or 3 times our clothes before disposing them in landfills. So something is wrong, and we are working very hard at our accelerator program into transforming that model with the 5 R's. So the reuse, refurbish, repair, and recycle, all those solutions that will enable us to make this closed loop of resources within the textile industry. So these are the topics we'd like to address today. Again, we have a small group, so please feel free to jump in with questions. That's the whole point. We'd like to explain to you what are the challenges of the industry, what are we doing in our accelerator program, and eventually we'll go across some of the great innovations we've helped and supported in the past 18 months. That being said, Emma.
Hello, so I'm going to start off a little bit with some scary facts about the fashion industry and why it's so important that we try and tackle it as a sustainability issue. So first up, I don't know if you know, but obviously we've got 1.5 degrees Celsius is what scientists have decided is sort of like the sort of limit to which the climate can increase. And if the fashion industry continues growing at the rate that it currently is, it will actually take up 36% of the carbon budget that we have. And that's not surprising because the fashion industry is actually really, really large. It is $1.3 trillion industry, and it actually employs 300 million people across the whole value chain. So actually it's quite important in terms of jobs and economic development and growth. So it's not bad in itself, it just needs to change in order to be more sustainable. So these are the main areas of the value chain, and I'm going to be looking a little bit into sort of how the impact is from the raw materials to the dyeing and to the end of use. And one of the biggest areas and one of the biggest issues within each of these sort of parts of the value chain, and also looking at sort of what innovation can be used to change it. So if we start off with raw materials are split mainly between synthetic fabrics and natural fabrics. And synthetics make up about 60% of the fibers that we wear today. And these synthetics come from non-renewable resources like polyester, nylon, elastane, and actually in order to create these synthetic materials, we use 342 million barrels of oil per year. And the biggest issue with this is not only is it non-renewable, but these take up to 200 years to biodegrade in the environment. On the other hand, we also have the natural fibers, and if you think that's probably better for the environment, unfortunately, not necessarily the case. So natural fibers like cotton, which is about 27% of the fiber of the industry, it can take up to 3,000 litres of water in order to create 1 kilo of cotton, and it can take an extra 3 kilograms of insecticides and pesticides. And the biggest issue with those is that, they create sort of eutrophication. Sorry, I always get that word wrong. But you get algae blooms within the environment, and this can really affect biodiversity. And the other thing is the biggest cotton sort of country producers are India and China, and these tend to be areas where there's high water stress, which means that, there's not that much fresh water to go around as it is. And it's usually grown on land that's arable and could be used for other kinds of crops. So, there's a big sustainability issue within cotton. Other materials you can look out for are obviously like tencel or viscose and lysocell. So I recommend sort of materials like tencel is definitely a sustainable option. But other viscose can have issues with the hard solvents that they use in order to create the cellulosic fiber. And, if these chemicals are not treated properly when they go into waterways, it can actually sort of have a really detrimental effect on the environment. So today, I'm going to tell you all, see if you can look out for recycled polyesters, organic cottons, and sort of like tencel and lysocell fibers is the difference that everyone can make to try and make the fashion industry slightly more sustainable. The second sort of area of the value chain where we see a lot of issues is within dyeing and finishing. So dyeing and finishing uses a lot of chemicals. I think we're all aware of that, but also a lot of water as well. So it's about 150 litres of water are needed to dye just 1 kilogram of clothing. And most of the dyes and the chemicals in these waters, if they go straight in the waterways, then there's a lot of toxins and chemicals build up in the environment. And these tend to be bioaccumulative, so they sort of progress through the food chain, and they're really hard to break down. If you want to know more about it, if you check out the Detox Greenpeace report, actually they have a really nice list of the sort of chemicals and the brands that they're trying to sort of reduce them in the value chain. So it's things like PFCs and waterproofing materials are ones you really want to look out for. And then you get to your clothing and you finally buy it in the shop and you think, hey, I've made all the right choices, I've got my recycled polyester, I've got my organic cotton, but unfortunately here there is also issues for the environment. So when you actually wash your clothing in the washing machine and in the dryer, that as well takes a ton of sort of energy. So yeah, 120 million tons of CO2 just from like washing and drying our clothes. And on top of that, I'm sure we've all heard of the issue with microfiber pollution. So polyesters and synthetics, every time you wash them, the little fibers come off your clothes and into the world's waterways, to a point now that it's meant to be the equivalent of 50 billion bottles of water from our clothes go into the world's oceans. And they have actually found like these microfibers in feces from like humans. They find it like in polar bears in the Arctic, like it's everywhere. You can't avoid it. Thankfully, on a little more positive note, we're looking at some sort of microfiber solutions and some startups and innovations that are out there. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail of those a bit later on, but it's not all doom and gloom. And the main thing you can do to be more sustainable in your clothes is just to wear them for longer. So if we bought less and we all wore what we had, I think that is the main way that you can try and increase sustainability. Unfortunately, at the moment, that's not happening. So if we look at the rate of growth of how much we buy, depending on sort of how much we're actually using, we are buying more clothes now, more than ever, and wearing them less. So actually, we wear our clothes 36% less than we did 15 years ago. So despite all of the sort of horrible things that happen during our clothing in the production, we don't actually value the end product. So those are huge externalities that no one's paying the price for. Last but not least, what happens to your clothing once you've finished with it? Well, the biggest issue is that over 73% of clothing just goes directly to landfill or to the incinerator, and only 1% of clothing actually makes it back into new clothes. So I think one of the things we're trying to do is try to make a more circular economy. And thankfully, the second-hand clothing industry is now worth $4 billion. So it's growing, in developed countries as well as developing countries. And like I said, one of the most sustainable things you can do is just wear your clothes longer. If that's you who's wearing it longer or someone else, it doesn't matter. But we just have to try and extend the life cycle of our clothes in order to have a more circular economy. There's also recycling techniques that we're looking into. So there's mechanical recycling. So this is mainly for natural fibers, but unfortunately, the more you recycle them, the shorter the fibers get. So you actually have to still have the additional new fibers in all of the recycled fabrics you have. The other option is chemical recycling. So those innovations are actually really interesting, and I'm going to talk about some of those later on. And there's more and more chemical recycling coming out there. But once again, you have to add new chemicals, and you have to sort of use a lot of energy. But you can save about 40% of the energy from producing new materials. But, I still think if we just try and value the clothes we have, it'll be a more circular solution. Hey, there we go. So basically, when the population by 2030 is meant to hit about 8.5 billion, and if the sort of consumption and the growth of demand for clothing continues the way that it currently does, the fashion industry is going to increase by about 63%. So this pressure that we already have on sort of materials and water, and also the labor and the energy that goes into clothing is only going to increase. So we really need to find ways to sort of stop that pressure from building, because actually the fashion industry is just going to collapse in on itself at some point if we don't find good solutions. So water consumption is only going to increase, and energy emissions are only going to go up. So yeah, that's kind of where we come in with Fashion for Good. So we're trying to find innovations for all of these areas in the value chain, just to see sort of what the new future of fashion could look like. And I think Isabelle can go a little bit further into that.
Thanks, Emma, for depicting the very dark picture of where we stand now. Do you have any questions at this point, or shall we go on? So I'm coming in for the shameless promotional part, self-promotional part of the presentation. The idea is really we're not selling anything. So we're just trying to explain to you what is the model we have developed to accelerate those innovations. As Emma said, the impact is growing very fast, and as much as we try to the supply chain is trying to put it together, the incremental improvements, water efficiency, energy efficiency, we now come to a point that we need disruptive innovations. And how do we identify, how do we support them, how do we implement them in the supply chain is what we're trying to achieve at Fashion for Good. One thing that you need to know as well is the textile industry is extremely complex. The first thing is the consumer rules the world. They are the one who are dictating what they want. The brands are the one who will decide which innovations suit the consumer and whether the price point is right. But at the end of the day, it's the suppliers, the manufacturers, the spinners, the dye houses that will have to implement those innovations. So we have a large number of stakeholders we have to put together to make sure that those innovations are developed in as fast as we can. So last year, it was in March already, 17, we launched Fashion for Good in Amsterdam. And Fashion for Good is a global innovation to support those technologies. Fashion for Good partnered with Plug and Play, so it's quite a unique partnership. So I have Plug and Play on the one. Does anybody know Plug and Play in the room? So I will explain. Plug and Play is one of the largest corporate innovation platforms in the world. So we're Silicon Valley based, and if you know Y Combinator, 500 startups, Techstars, Plug and Play is essentially the fourth biggest accelerator in the world. So we have our headquarters in the Silicon Valley, but we also run about 30 programs around the world, focused each on industry specific and bringing together the ecosystem of corporations that work together to support the startups of that specific industry. I can give an example. You might be running startups in very diverse industries, so please check Plug and Play. There must be one of our accelerators that is fit for your sector. We in Stuttgart have a mobility automotive accelerator program in partnership with Daimler, Mercedes, Porsche. We have a fintech accelerator in Paris with BNP Paribas. We have a health with Roche in Munich. We have a bunch of accelerators in Europe, in Asia, and obviously in our headquarters in the US. And what we do is simply provide to the startups what they need. And in that sense, we're a bit different from other accelerators. We do not take equity. We don't take any money from the startups. What we provide to them is the access to the market they are trying to reach. This was for 30 seconds ago. So this is our basically global footprint. And this is our corporate ecosystem. We work now with over 200 corporations in the world across all verticals, from fintech, insurtech, health, travel, you name it. And what is interesting is one company will start working with Plug and Play for their relevant vertical, but will also have access to all the startups of our ecosystem across the world. So this is essentially what we provide to the startups. So all the resources that an early stage company require, logistics, a place to work, mentors that can help on business models, on pitching, etc. We provide connections to investors. So Plug and Play, we are one of the most active early stage investors in the world. We invest in over 250 companies every year. But we are seed investors, and we also connect our startups to our connections in the VC world, whether it's in the Silicon Valley or in Europe or wherever our programs are based. We run a number of events per year, actually a huge amount of events per year. This is how, exactly like what we're doing here today, it's exposure, giving a lot of exposure to the startups through programs, events we run, but also bringing startups to the events of our partners, supplier events, etc. And eventually, finally, the most important part of our program, as I was saying, is the access to the corporations that help validate the market fit, help get feedback on their services or product, and really having inside informations from the target market, and obviously discuss business development opportunities such as piloting. So this is Fashion for Good. This picture is actually the real picture of our building in Amsterdam. We're happy to be located in a very traditional canal house in the center of Amsterdam. And Plug and Play is one of those, we're located in one of those floors. And Fashion for Good was initially launched by the foundation of the CNA, which is one of the largest Dutch retailers, in order to bring together the whole industry to transform to transform the textile industry toward a circular model. It was based on the fact that to be fast and disruptive, we need two things: innovation and collaboration. So let's bring everybody together in the same roof, under the same roof, and work together on helping those startups. There are two main things. On the left-hand side is the innovation part. We've built an innovation platform with the accelerator program that Emma and I are running. We have another program that is run by Fashion for Good, which is a scaling program, which is meant to support a bit more mature companies that are on their roadmap to scale. So once they've been identified and accelerated, they can then, once they have piloted with brands, go into that, what we call the scaling phase. And then we are now putting together a fund, a 100 million fund that will cover the implementation of those technologies within the supply chain, meaning Bangladesh, Vietnam, India, where the supply chain is located, by providing funding to the manufacturers when they would like to switch to those new technologies and solutions within their own supply chain. On the right hand, this is the convener for change, and this is how we also, we believe to be, we are open innovation platform, so everybody who is willing to help give a hand is welcome in our building. We have a co-working space welcoming other institutions like the Organic Cotton Accelerator, Cradle to Cradle, ZDHC, the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. All of them work in our building, as it is how we communicate and collaborate better. 3 weeks ago, we also have launched a new exhibition. We actually call it our new technology museum, and this is how we address the consumer part of raising awareness. We won't change the industry only by working with brands and manufacturers. We will also change the industry by raising the awareness of consumer. Consumer needs to pressure the industry to be more sustainable. So we have 3 floors in our building that are dedicated to a forward-looking museum, very educative, like trying to explain exactly what we're doing here, what is wrong with the industry, but also being very positive in a way. This is the innovations we are working with and how the future could look like. So that being said, I think we have, if it works, basically showing what we've put together in our museum. I'll talk a bit about the innovation platform, and this is exactly what I was explaining, is putting together an ecosystem of partners to work together. And we need the investors, we need the manufacturers, the retailers, the brands, and obviously the innovators. I'll run through that very quickly because Emma mentioned it briefly in her presentation. But if you happen to be a startup in the room and interested in our program, these are the technologies we're looking for. These are the technologies the brands are looking for. So one important thing that runs our program is we work for corporations into finding the startups that address their challenges. So we are not just finding cool startups, promising startups, and push them to brands. This would not work. So we work with our brands, and we work currently with about 10 partners, and you will recognize most of those names. They're pretty prestigious and big in the retail industry, and we basically ask them what are their innovation needs, their challenges, their priorities, and based on that, we scout globally by using our plug-and-play network and find the startups that will enter the program. And this is our selection process, so it's quite standard, but altogether, since last year, we have built a database of around 1,000 startups that fit the criteria, that are global. And according to those innovation priorities, we run 2 programs per year, twice 3 months. We pre-select a number of startups, and then we jointly with the corporate partners screen the selection into finding the one that will enter the program. And we work with about 10 to 15 companies in each batch. And this is briefly what we've achieved since last year. So we're now halfway or almost done with the 4th batch of the accelerator program. Altogether, we worked with about 50 early stage companies from 16 countries. We've provided over 500 one-on-one introductions between our corporate, our brands, and our partners and those early stage companies. If I may take this example of the current batch we're working with, we are, as I was saying, halfway the program. They will graduate end of November. We have 12 startups, and we already have about 23 pilots in discussions. So it really boosts. In a few weeks, you can talk to the right people in the right brand and discuss concrete piloting opportunities. This will probably not work either. No, too bad. I think we're doing quite good on time. What we'd like to do, again, if you don't have any specific questions on the program or on the industry in general, I think Emma can run you through a few of the cool startups, cool examples we've worked with in the past 18 months. Yes. So that's very important you're not applying to one batch. You're applying to the accelerator program, and for each batch, we look at who has applied and see the best fit. And if you're not the best fit for one batch, you might be a good fit for the following batch, because we might have new corporate partners, new needs, new requests. So it's always good to send us application. It's quite easy and through the website, so that we know you exist and we can connect you with the corporate partners if there's any fit.
And are you looking at any particular stage in the development of the
Well, we need, in general, we ask for companies that have already an MVP. We don't provide technical support to the startups. So R&D support, we're not engineers, so we try to, it's really a business development accelerator, so you need to be at kind of that stage. But in terms of how advanced, it's quite diverse, we're stage agnostic. And it happens that quite often we bring startups that are active in other industries, typically traceability blockchain solutions for the food industry that are also relevant for the supply chain of textile, and they could be very advanced. As long as there is a potential fit to disrupt the current industry, we're good.
Any other questions? All right, so I'm just going to talk through a couple of the startups that we've worked with so far, and honestly, it's been a pleasure working with them, and a lot of them are sort of super innovative. So as you can see in these little lovely logos, we work with startups across all of the parts of the value chain. We also have social startups that work with sort of the labor issues within the fashion industry, so that doesn't necessarily part of the value chain, but is definitely a priority for us as well. So first of all, our main criteria, we work off William McDonough's 5 goods. So when we're looking at a startup, we want to see how it fits into these 5 goods. So it's sort of good economy, good water, good energy, good lives, and good materials. And basically the idea there is from cradle to cradle that the sort of value creation of the product is going to be good across all of those 5 criteria. So we're trying to find innovations within the space. Gives a little bit more of a description of that. So first of all, how many of you know that leather is actually very, very bad for the environment in terms of a sustainable material? So the main issue with leather is the sort of the tans that go into it, but also just, you know, the whole economy of sort of using an animal and growing an animal in order to create a fabric is hugely inefficient. So Provenance is a fantastic startup coming out of San Francisco, and basically they're able to create leather out of collagen. So they can grow leather in a lab, so it doesn't need an animal, it doesn't need extra energy in the process. You can purely make it in a lab with sort of a fermentation process. So that's one of the sort of really innovative ones that we were sort of had a real fun time working with. It's slightly out there. I think they're using the collagen of some extinct species almost in order to create really, really cool fabrics. So keep an eye out for those. We also have Algalife. So Algalife is this company that is able to create dyes and also materials out of algae. Now the thing is with algae, you want to be a little bit careful of the supply chain because a lot of algae is sort of harvested from the oceans, and it can actually be quite bad for the environment, especially when you're creating alginate, which is quite a chemically heavy process. And what's beautiful about Algalife is they can create these beautiful dyes and these beautiful materials straight out of algae that they grow sort of on land that you can't sort of use for farmland because it's sort of in Australia even, in the middle of the bush. And it uses seawater and it doesn't have any chemicals or any pesticides. So you can really create a very, very sustainable product, and it's biodegradable as well. And the dyes that they make, you'd be surprised, are beautiful sort of blues and pinks and reds. So it's not just green, as you can see in that lovely photo over there. And one of the other ones, Mango Materials, that we worked with in our last batch, are able to make a biodegradable plastic called PHA. And they do that using the methane from waste treatment plants. So waste treatment plants use a lot of methane, which is actually quite a sort of unsustainable gas. I think we all know it's sort of a contributor towards sort of global warming. But they're able to sort of siphon it off and use it for good things. So basically, when these bacteria are in the presence of methane, they produce this biodegradable plastic PHA. And they're able to make these into fibers. So hopefully one day, all of our polyester will come from these biodegradable materials. And then the microfiber issues are totally fine because it's completely marine biodegradable, and we'll be able to wash our clothes in peace. Colorifics is another really fun one. So we're going back to bacteria. So basically, they're able to make sort of a lot of colors out of bacteria that they genetically modify. So you can take any color in nature, put it into a bacteria, and ferment it. And, you know, it's a really sustainable dye because not only are these completely natural colors, but the bacteria itself is able to fix onto the fiber. So you don't need any fixation chemicals. and you don't need any extra solvents, which is really cool. And I think this is one of our personal favorites because they recently dyed a dress with Stella McCartney, so we're hoping, that's a little glimpse into the future. Nature coatings can make carbon black out of trees. So I don't know if you know it, but how many of you are all wearing black today? Put your hand up. So carbon black is actually from the petroleum industry, and basically it's a pretty unsustainable dye, and it all comes from sort of oil. So instead, nature coatings have this wonderful process where they're able to create carbon black out of sustainably forested trees, and it's completely circular, so that the heat that they create from sort of burning the wood is burnt so cleanly that it actually runs the machines that create the dye. So actually it's quite fun. And they have a completely sort of waterless dyeing process as well. So we're hoping that one's going to take off. And last but not least, we are spin dye. It's quite a sort of interesting way of sort of dyeing recycled polyester. So the idea is plastic is quite hard to dye, and polyester, as a result, is very hard to dye, which is odd because all the other plastic you see around you, they just add the dye straight into the material. So if you look at this lovely remote, like no one's dyeing this as a white product. They're literally just putting the black straight into the plastic. So that's the idea of We Are Spin Dye, where you add the pigment directly into the extrusion process of the polyester, which means you can save millions of litres of water across the fashion industry. The only difference is, designers need to have a little bit more forethought about what colours they want to put into their future sort of lines and styles. But if everyone just sort of gave it like an extra 3 weeks and decided on the colour before they started creating it, we could save so much water in the fashion industry. Last but not least, these are sort of our more sort of good economy, sort of more use sort of startups that we worked with. So previously I was talking about microfibers, so the 50 billion microfibers that are currently in the sea. Planet-KIC is a lovely Slovenian startup that we worked with who will be pitching later today at 3 p.m. within the main hall if anyone wants to check them out. And basically they're able to create a filter that sort of filters out all of the microfibers in your wash. Well, not all, I think there's about 75%, which is much higher than any other solutions out there. And basically what they do is they 3D print these little filters, and you can plug them straight into your washing machine and collect all the microfibers out of it. They also have a solution where it sort of magnetically throw it into the drum, and it can collect all of these microfibers within your washing machine. So that's a really sort of fun one out there, because I think a lot of us are sort of more and more worried about the microfiber pollution that we might personally be creating. And Style End. This is my penultimate one. Don't worry, I realize this is quite a long list. So that's a really cool rental company, because one of the other things about the circular economy is if we just use our clothes more, that's a real way to make them more sustainable. And rather than making one-off purchases for an expensive dress that you might wear to a wedding, you can rent it instead. So it's very much like Rent the Runway, but the difference is it's coming from the consumers themselves. So I can go to my wardrobe and start renting out my clothes that I might not wear that often. So it's really sort of trying to sort of make use of all the clothing you have in the closet. Because apparently you do not wear 80% of the stuff that you own. I don't know if that's true for men, but for women I imagine that might be the case. And last but not least, for the end of use, we have Titan. So one of the biggest issues, I think, within recycling is the fiber blends that we all have. So most modern fabrics are made from synthetics and natural polyester, like unnatural fibers. And then that can make the recycling process almost impossible because they create sort of very different sort of materials, and they need very different processes. And Titan's one of the first companies that's able to separate the synthetic fibers from the natural fibers, and it can make new cellulosic fibers like viscose from the natural, such as cotton, and it can make recycled polyester in almost virgin material quality from the polyesters that you find in the nylons as well. So hopefully, with these startups, from a more hopeful note from what I started off this presentation with, we can find a way to have a more sort of sustainable and circular fashion industry. And once again, my main role is with scouting and to try and find all these new innovations and to see what's out there. So if you know of anyone who might be able to sort of help us, or sort of we can sort of help through our program in any of these sort of areas across the value chain in the fashion industry, please come find me.